Is immigration a problem that politicians are choosing to avoid? That's what Lionel Shriver thinks, who has written about the figures for her magazine column this week. She joins me now, along with demographer and author of The 8 Billion, Jennifer D. Sciubba. Lionel, I'll start with you first. You write in this week's magazine about last week's net migration figures and a certain sense of fatalism from the public towards them. Explain your argument as you set out in this week's Spectator.
Well, if you look at the polls in both the United States and the UK, there's a lot of popular pressure for reduced immigration, that it's too much too fast, and nobody asked the people who actually live in these countries whether they were interested in a mass redesign of their population. And yet there seem to be no political parties of big enough to matter who are seriously devoted to clamping down on the quantity and the rapidity of incomers in both our countries. And it makes people angry, but it also makes them feel impotent. And I'm afraid that in this column, I confess to the fact that I have become unhealthily addicted to reading the comments after articles about immigration in a whole range of papers. And one of the most interesting things about that sampling is that the same rage plus impotence in these comments is not only where you would expect them in the Telegraph, or the Spectator, but and in the Wall Street Journal, of course, but even in the New York Times. And that's shocking. And New Yorkers have had a real taste of immigration close up because New York is now inundated with what New York thinks is a lot of immigrants and what the border communities think is a drop in the bucket.
Jennifer, I mean, there's no doubt these figures that came out last week and the last 2 years have been, extraordinary numbers for the UK to take, 700,000, 600,000 or so. What do you make of Lionel's piece, and what's your attitude generally to mass migration of the kind we've seen in recent years?
Yeah. The thing about these liberal democracies that we live in, and liberal meaning just, we're supposed to be giving people the right to speak up here, is that we are not going to see any big change in immigration policy because there's pressures on both the right and the left for openness, and there's pressures on both the right and the left for closure. So I think the heart of Lionel's piece saying we're stuck and we're not seeing any change, the politicians are stuck, the people are stuck, it is absolutely true, but it's baked into the system. And so that's where, as a political scientist with that hat on, I see that it's been that way for decades and decades, and it will be that way in the future. A lot of what I do is talk to businesses and governments about, what will the future of demographics be like, and what will the future of policy be like? And my answer with immigration is it will be exactly the same, because the way these systems are designed, it doesn't allow for really rational policy. And in fact, democracy itself really encourages catering to niche interests and catering to fear. And there's always a lot of fear around demographic change.
Lionel, I mean, do you think that the reasons politicians aren't addressing it, how much is it to do with sort of a lack of initiative, a lack of desire to talk about this? I mean, this morning I was watching the Home Affairs Select Committee here in Westminster, and it was extraordinary that the fact that some of the top civil servants, for instance, didn't know the figures about how many people were arriving, being detained, being deported, etc., after their asylum claims failed. Is it about a lack of political will, or is it simply we just don't have the technical capabilities to follow on that desire to try and stop the population rise?
I submit in my column that most politicians don't know how to stop immigration, even if they wanted to. In a lot of instances, they don't care enough to want to, but they're fundamentally feckless. And, there are, especially in the UK and Europe generally, huge legal barriers to enforcing your own borders, and they just strike everyone as insurmountable. And it's like, oh, I'm sorry. The helplessness that I detect in those comment threads, I also detect in politicians. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. It would be hard. And I'm not sure I accept the fatalistic position that this is just going to keep happening and there's nothing to do. But in order to do something, it would take enormous political will. It would take a lot of political change. It would, in the UK, it would take a complete transformation of the civil service of the Home Office, which basically regards itself as, Britain's open door. And that's where my fatalism kicks in. I don't see that happening. I don't see politicians really reversing themselves and making the sacrifices and taking the political risks that would be required to at least narrow that open door. There are countries in the world who have very strict immigration policies, and granted, they take a demographic hit. It means that they have older populations. Talk about, for example, Japan. But it's worth it to them. They have decided that they would rather have a shrinking population and a coherent one rather than introduce the kind of atomization and conflict that we have accepted in the rest of the West.
Yes, Jennifer, Lionel there touched on the point about social cohesion, and that seems to be the real sort of nub of the issue here, which is that people don't feel as though perhaps immigration is being something done to them in their communities. Are there any kind of policy solutions for policymakers to look at when doing this? And is there a possibility of the case that, as Lionel says, migration is an issue certainly of increased political salience here? Is there a way of making perhaps immigration more popular, mass immigration more popular among in countries which are experiencing a lot of it, if it's a matter of better policy solutions? Or will people always be hostile to large numbers of people arriving if there's a sense perhaps that they're not being catered to?
Yeah, I think the problem that all the politicians take is that they're looking for big, splashy reforms, and those will never pass. And that's the case across many policy areas. We see it. I talk a lot about retirement policies. It's, big things like Macron trying to raise retirement age. To actually make an impact, you don't have to do the big things that will never pass. You do smaller things, but the smaller things are not sexy, and you're not rewarded for that with votes. There are so many ways to ease the perception of quote unquote takeover by immigration, because honestly, at the end of the day, the numbers are interesting, but it's perception that matters the most. It's how you feel. And I remember 20 years ago looking at some of the numbers of migration into Europe that were much smaller, but the perception and the feeling and the rhetoric and the debate sounded exactly the same. So you have to start moving into nitty-gritty policies. Like, do you have enough resources in local schools to help with non-English speaking students who are being put into classrooms so that the community feels like their children are supported and the new incomer children are supported as well? Well, nobody wants to run on that platform. That's boring. You want to do something that really tries to, cater to specific voting groups. So yes, there are so many policies that can be done. In the US, our asylum adjudication system is incredibly underfunded and understaffed. Well, that's a boring thing for a politician to talk about fixing, even though you would think both the left and the right would have a vested interest in fixing that system. So I think we're really stuck until we have politicians who are not putting first their own reelection and instead are thinking about how to actually make the system work for everyone.
Lionel, I was wanting to ask you, you obviously in your column talk mostly about that kind of shared sense of fatalism, and particularly between the UK and the US. But I just wondered, in terms of the immigration debate and mass migration, what are the differences between the two countries in terms of, obviously there's the issue around the UK being an island as opposed to having a large landmass with Mexico, for instance. But what do you see are the kind of similarities and contrasts between the two nations in their migration approach?
Well, one of the big differences is religion, because and that's another spanner in the works, emotionally and culturally, because the UK has a much higher immigration rate of Muslims, whereas in the US, basically they're coming from everywhere, but especially from Latin America, increasingly from India, and even from China. The Chinese are coming up through the southern border, which is really surprising. China's a long way away. I would say they share the same fecklessness, a complete operational failure. And also they share a political relationship to immigration because, the so-called elite is very big on multiculturalism and basically believes in open borders, which is not the case with the population. So you've got people in charge who are completely at odds with their populace, and at the same time, you've got massive operational failure, inability to deal with the numbers. And I guess the biggest contrast between the two is that in the UK, the problem, if you look at it as a problem, is legal immigration. And whereas in the US, it's mostly illegal immigration and to the tune of millions of people per year. The Biden administration has probably let in about 8 million people. And that is, even in a nation of 330 million people, that's starting to change the nature of your population in a tiny period of time.
There's another difference, if I may, with the U.S. as well, just to add on to that, and that's our two-party system. Because even though you might have segments of the population that are very upset about the current immigration levels or the nature of that immigration, the way the system is right now, the levels and numbers, it works for the politicians. They do not face a penalty for what is happening. And that's because we just have these two big groups. So when we look at polls, yes, people might, as Lionel mentions in her column, people might say that they want lower immigration. But when you start asking them to rank the issues that they care the most about, you start asking them about the salience of that issue for them and what really gets them to turn up to vote, immigration starts to move down the list. So that means nobody has to actually do anything. There'll be a lot of talk about it in all of the debates. It'll be all over the media, but they won't actually face an electoral penalty for doing nothing. Some political scientists have called it talk tough and do nothing, because you don't have to. And so that's where we start to see some really big differences between the United States two-party system and then some of the continental European systems that have multiple parties. And that's why you see some of those parties starting to gain more electoral victories on an anti-immigration platform. And that is because there are more of them to choose from.
I'd say there is also one other big difference, and that's Trump, right? The UK doesn't have a Trump. And, the immigration is moving up voters' list of concerns. I know in the UK, it's now number 3, and that's counting everybody, including all those Labour voters and Green voters. It still gets to number 3. And I don't actually know the rankings for the US right now, but it is a huge factor in Trump's popularity. And he is the only politician who is appreciably talking about mass immigration and wanting to stop it. And by the way, I say this as someone who does not support Trump, never has, and dreads another Trump presidency. But those pictures of the border, these tens of thousands of people moving across shallow areas of the Rio Grande, being received by the border control, being put into buses and shipped all over the country with virtually no paperwork and theoretical appointments with immigration judges literally years from now. Those pictures are politically dynamite.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Lionel.